And to start our work, we would like to invite Salman Shaikh from the Shaikh group to give us the keynote speech. Salman Shaikh is the founder and CEO of the Shaikh group, which is a political consultancy established to facilitate dialogue and conflict resolution in the MENA region. Prior to this, he has been director of the Brookings Doha Center from 2011 to 2015, and he has worked for the United Nations for nearly a decade, including as special assistant to the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, and also as a political advisor to the UN Secretary General's personal representative for Lebanon in 06 to 07. So please welcome with me Salman Shaikh.
Well, good morning, Sabah here. It's wonderful and very humbling actually to come and speak and start off with the keynote speech here. I want to thank Rania, who I met on the Google campus a few weeks ago in California, as well as Maya, and of course a special hello to our hosts here, Professor Andrea Old, and the rest of you. I'm particularly humbled to be speaking in front of so many Syrian youth. I didn't know so many of you would be here, so it makes this experience even more rewarding for me. I've been asked to speak a little bit about the integration of Syrians in Europe, what is working, what are the challenges, to give you a little bit of an overview. I think that what is working bit, many of you will know better than me, given that you are so much involved personally or professionally, both in that particular effort. I guess I can draw on my own experience. I am originally Pakistani. I grew up in Britain. I remember at the age of 5, 6, taking the plane. In fact, I wet my bed. And in the middle of the night in Karachi, getting on the plane to bring me to this new land. Now, we were lucky. My father was a petroleum engineer. We were received by a guy in a top hat and got into a nice car to go to a London hotel. But even then, I still very much remember how so fascinating and traumatic that experience was. And it has stayed with me ever since. So maybe I will draw a little bit more on that as well when I talk about integration and the challenges that one faces in that regard. First of all, just in terms of a very quick overview with regards to refugees. Of course, the refugees, Syrian refugees, we must first and foremost talk about what's going on in Syria and in the region itself. I spend most of my waking hours with my team focusing on trying to pull together ideas for a political process and a political solution when it comes to Syria. In fact, I'm just coming late last night from Stockholm, where we put together another group of Syrians for a Syrian discussion on ideas to do with constitutional reform. But I have to tell you, as you know, and many of you know who follow this day in, day out, the situation in your country, Syria, is not good. The cessation, the hudna of hostilities seems to be breaking down. The Geneva process seems to be in a state of paralysis, and in the absence of that, we don't even seem to have the bare minimum when it comes to the protection and well-being of Syrians, all of Syria's civilians. In fact, to quote the senior officials in the ICRC, we're in a sinkhole where there is no bottom. And in that respect, we look at an immediate situation whereby which we must find ways and means, and we must find hope in which to arrest what is going on. Maybe I'll draw on that a little bit later as well. Now, of course, in terms of the refugee numbers, you have more than 4.5 million, in fact, probably closer to 5 million refugees now in 5 countries: Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt. Turkey, of course, hosts probably more than 2.6, 2.7 million of those refugees. Lebanon probably has one out of 4 or 5 people which is now Syrian refugees. Jordan, more than 10-15% of the population are now Syrians. And of course Iraq, which already has an internal displacement of probably 4 million of its own people, hosts probably close to more than a quarter of a million refugees. And then of course there is Egypt as well. In the midst of all of that, the UN and other humanitarian agencies are struggling to really fill the kind of funding needs that are needed. The UN, the latest UN appeals are not more than 60% funded. And that means that, for example, a Syrian refugee in Lebanon receives just about $21 a month, or around 70 cents a day in terms of food assistance. That's well below the UN's poverty line of something like $1.90 a day. I say all of this because the pressures and the coping mechanisms for those refugees in the neighborhood are immense. And of course, again, those of you who are Syrian will know that from your families, those who have in fact made it out of the country itself. At least 450,000 people in these 5 main host countries, or 10%, are in need of resettlement, according to the UNHCR. Amnesty International and others call for at least 10% of Syria's most vulnerable refugees to be resettled by the end of 2016. And yet, the numbers that we are talking about in terms of resettlement in Europe are far, far below that, as you know, which I'll refer to. Now, with regards to refugees in Europe, World War II was, of course, a traumatic moment for this particular continent. And Europe is not new to refugees. The internal displacement and the refugees that took place in the midst of that Second World War is testimony to that. We had more than 40 million, particularly from Central and Eastern Europe. In fact, probably 150 to 300,000 Central Eastern Europeans, Poles, Greeks, those from the Balkans, went east. There were camps, and if you look at the pictures, there were refugee camps in Aleppo. There were refugee camps in Egypt, and even in southern Palestine, in Nuseirat, for example. And if you look at some of the newsreels and what was being discussed, it's not, if you strip away the actual time, it's actually quite interesting that, you know, there was a similar discourse which was taking place. Of course, not in the lightning speed that we have today, especially with social media and the new media. And I say this also because those refugees did receive support. Those Poles did receive support. And yet we have a Polish government which seems not to want to settle any Syrian refugees today. Of course, the Second World War did then lead to a system of laws and institutions to deal with refugees. And you had international action which led to the Convention on Human Rights, the Refugee Convention of 1951, and its protocol in 1967, which spread to a more global regime, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and of course the United Nations High Commission for Refugees was founded in that period as well. And then of course Europe also, in terms of refugees, had to deal with the fall of the Iron Curtain. And here again we had hundreds of thousands of refugees, and I can't think of a better, more inspiring place to say that than Berlin. I know most people think that I probably say in every city I go to, it is one of my favorite places, but really Berlin is for all sorts of incredibly wonderful reasons, including, of course, as a symbol of what is possible at that time and even today in terms of how Germany and its leadership has dealt, or tried to address with the refugee crisis today. And then, of course, just to spread this a little bit wider, the United States took around 500,000 South Vietnamese refugees as well. So since the Second World War, and of course we've had huge flows of migration in other continents as well, not least Africa. James Traub, I think in a very hard-hitting article in February 2016, talked about Europe's moral test today. A desperate humanity today has presented a very much a moral test, the likes of which Europe has not faced since the Second World War. It's a test which he says could lead to a collective triumph, but which has instead led to real concern and for some collective failure. I'm not going to focus on the negative here exclusively. I do want to talk about what has where we can be inspired going forward in what is, of course, a long-term problem. But we must also take into the factors that is leading us into this kind of discourse that James Traub talks about. Europe has not experienced real economic growth for a decade. There is the spectre of terrorism. I live in Paris. I was in Paris on that horrible day last year. And of course, there is a rising fear about the pressures on economic conditions and welfare that perhaps can result as a result of large numbers of people coming into European countries. Europe, of course, has received 1 million refugees in about 18 months. 500,000 of these were Syrians. Actually, the majority, young men, probably 60%, about a fifth, 20% or so children, and less than that, about 16% are women. Germany, of course, has taken the largest number, about 420,000, and again, you all are probably much more knowledgeable about these kinds of figures than myself, in 2015, and the other is Sweden. I'm coming from Sweden, and I'll speak a little bit about the Swedish experience in a minute. Sweden has taken, in just 1 year, about 160,000, the highest per capita in Europe, at about 2% of its population. There is a plan to deal with Syrian refugees, that is to take in about 160,000 across 27, 28 EU states. That is, though, still only about 3.6% of the population of refugees that have gone to the neighbouring states. So far, regrettably, I think, Europe officially has taken only a few hundred. Germany, again, has agreed to receive the largest share at about just over 40,000. And the remaining EU states at just over 31,000, or 0.7% of the Syrian refugee population. There's also here a reliance on Turkey, as you know, to hold back those Syrian refugees, or at least provide an orderly way for them to be processed and applications made before they come to Europe. Being paid $3.2 billion to pledge that, as well as visa-free travel for Turks and other such things. But as you know, that particular deal is under some strain. And I think there's probably, I won't go into the politics of it all. I was in Istanbul last week, including speaking to Turkish officials. What I would say to you is that we must not rely on that deal. We must not rely on that deal, and there is a high chance that that deal can actually fall apart in the next few weeks. The refugee numbers, therefore, in Europe are likely to rise. And again, I've talked about the breakdown of the Geneva process. In fact, we are facing a perfect storm in terms of breakdown of that, increasing violence inside Syria, including more asymmetrical sectarian type of warfare, the kind of which we have seen over the last few weeks, as well as, of course, the worsening humanitarian condition. You know, when it's difficult to get in food into a place like DAAD since the start of the conflict, you know there's a real problem here. And yet, there are still serious efforts going on in that regard. In January alone, 70,000 Syrians took their life in their hands, tried to cross the Mediterranean. That is 13 times more than at the same time in January 2015. The IMF estimates that probably 1.3 million or more Syrian refugees will try to come to Europe in 2016 and 17. So that's the scale of what we are looking at. Both the coping mechanisms in those neighbouring states, the conflict itself as a driver, because these refugees don't appear, as you know, out of nowhere. There are factors which are pushing people in that regard. And that's why we have to focus on Syria first and foremost. And then, of course, there are the factors in Europe and in the international community. I said I would speak a little bit about Sweden. Sweden, of course, has a tradition of receiving refugees going back decades. It's sort of a belief that in integration and building a diverse, multicultural society, also a society that feels that there is a moral responsibility to do more when it comes to these kinds of conflicts in this region. And that's been reflected in its foreign and aid policies. It's received waves of refugees. Chilean, in fact, my first ever girlfriend was Chilean-Swedish years ago in London. Her father had run away from Pinochet, who was a university professor, lived in Göteborg. Iran, Somalia, Kurds, Eritreans, more than 100,000, largely Bosnian Muslims in the 1990s went to Sweden. At that time, there were far-right marches too. And what was at the time one of the biggest economic slowdowns in the Swedish economy since the 1930s. And yet, that experience, in fact, gave the Swedes some hope, a belief that they can still build an integrated society, even with Muslims, albeit Muslims from Europe. And today, you have Bosnian ministers, you have Bosnian doctors and teachers and others. And you have a very successful Iranian community, which ran away at the time of the Iranian Revolution in '79, etc. Now, whilst Sweden had probably integrated 40 to 80,000 refugees a year, that number has been doubled. We have 160,000, as I said, last year. That, some are saying, even for Sweden, is putting an unbearable strain on the social fabric of that society. The state budget dedicated to refugees has ballooned, probably now around about 15% of its $100 billion budget is to earmark for refugees, especially because of the education and social expenditures that have to be spent. This, in fact, has led to cuts in its overseas aid program. So, in order to look after the Syrian refugees and other refugees that are coming in, they are cutting budgets that would deal perhaps more with the sources of the problem elsewhere. But that is a fact of life that they have to face. There is a belief, therefore, that the diverse, multicultural society, which is a benefit, is now being severely tested. There's also a growing frustration, especially when it comes to recent entrants. They're not integrating fast enough. It's taking too long for them to get jobs. For example, Eritreans. Unemployment amongst them is probably around 50% in terms of or 50% before it takes them through 3 years or so to get a job, whereas with Swedes, probably 90% would get a job in that period. A third failed to graduate to their high school degrees, whereas a fifth of Swedes do. Point being is that there's an increasing worry and danger that these new entrants, or the newer people, are being isolated, and we never had the banlieues of Paris, of North Africans, but we are starting to see that in Sweden as well. Talk about more than 300 communities, areas in and around Sweden in that respect. Now, with regards to Syrian refugees, of course, figures when it comes to the level of attainment of education and more detailed stuff is still very difficult to get hold of, and I'd be interested to hear on the German side. The Swedish Migration Agency estimates that Syrians, half of them probably have high school degrees, and that many would require much more specialist support and help, and that this would place a huge burden in terms of the welfare payments that are made. This has all led to a situation where, in December, Sweden sharply reduced its refugee arrivals. It's much more a stricter criteria in terms of documentation required to cross borders. Papers are now required, which I think is in contravention of the Schengen Agreement, and that they're only accepting Syrian refugee asylum applications from those neighbouring countries, Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. But what you hear more is growing doubts about multiculturalism and integration. Words like, we're losing our identity, we're not recognising or feeling comfortable in our own homes. And of course, the net result of some of this is that even in Sweden, the right-wing Swedish Democrats are now second, third in the polls. And many believe that their political fortunes lie with the number of refugees and the pace at which they come in to the country. Sweden's not alone in that. Far-right parties are now first in the polls in the country I live in, France, in Switzerland, and of course we almost saw an Austrian president who represented those parties as well. This is the context, and I think we have to be honest when we deal with the context in terms of integration. But let me go back to my own story for a second. So I'm 5 years of age. We arrived in the UK. My father is a petroleum engineer. We moved to Great Yarmouth, which, if you know, is in the southeast of England. We are the only brown family in the neighbourhood. We live in a small village called Ormsby St. Margaret. I couldn't really speak much English. Both my sister and I had a special English teacher for the first 3-4 months of our schooling in this small little village in Ormsby St. Margaret. And yet, it was that opportunity for education, which is the reason, frankly, why my parents left. They were economic migrants, right? Why they left. And now, of course, I'm here. At least I'm able to speak to you in English. My brothers and sisters are engineers and lawyers, and all rather successful, all spread around the world. It really is about education. It is about unlocking the potential that each one of us have in this regard. And it's also, I guess, about finding a way for us to be able to feel that there is a future in our country. I never felt in the UK that I did not. I'll give you another story. Many years later, I was being interviewed by the British Foreign Secretary. So here I am in the India room, being interviewed by him. I am the son of a father who was under the British Empire, and yet I was being interviewed by him to be his special advisor. And I know this is actually the spirit of Europeans and the kind of values on which Europe has been built. Now, inevitably, in times of strain, there is a tension between those values and the cold, hard realities of what we face. But we must remind ourselves that this is a long-term project. Lives don't take a few months to make. And for that is my first, I guess, piece of advice to ourselves. We have to see the integration of Syrian communities as well as other refugee communities as a long-term project with very much long-term benefits. Syrians, I have had the pleasure to know now for more than 2 decades. I did meet Bashar al-Assad in 2000 and a number of times subsequently when I worked with the UN. That is not my favorite Syrian, but the Syrians that I have met over the years and in the work that I do fills me with a huge amount of hope that you are able to get through these challenges if you're given the help to do so. Syria is an old civilization, it has an old history, and dare I say, the support that is provided will actually be a huge force multiplier, not just for Syria, but for Syrians, but for the Eastern Mediterranean, and for the globe more so. And I wish that the international community, I wish world leaders would recognize that much more and do the very simple things that need to be done, at least when it comes to the welfare and protection of Syrians today. I want to, when I speak about bright spots, also personalize it a little bit. When I was doing a little bit of research, I don't know them personally, but I was inspired by the story of Raz al-Shatta, who many of you may know in the German context, who with his German colleague Jan Helig have written comedy sketches, which have now, I think, had a very great impact through YouTube and other such media, which they've taken a humorous look into the life of refugees in Europe. I think their example is one of why it's so important to speak to each other and to engage in that conversation through a variety of means. And again, I mentioned YouTube. I'm not saying it just because Rania was part of that wonderful game-changing setup, but we have those means today, both the virtual and those that enable the virtual to become the reality. There's Alex Assali, who fled to Germany a few years ago, who's, of course, his video of him feeding homeless people has gone in the streets of Berlin, it's gone viral. There's Jusoor who just a few months ago was pushing the listing boat and swimming, and has now, yesterday, incredibly made the Rio Olympic team as a swimmer. So, I mean, and then of course there are the kind of programs, the networking, the kind of help that is being provided by organizations such as Jusoor and others that are here. All I can say to you is all power to you. I know you are making a difference, and you will make a difference as long as everyone else remembers that this is a long-term project, but it will have, as I said, long-term benefits. Now, just to close, I want to just say a few words on what my wife and I have been doing, the We Care project. Incidentally, I met my wife, a French-Italian woman, in New York when I was working for the United Nations. And we have been together in the Middle East for about 15 years, on and off between East and West. My wife was actually in New York when 9/11 happened. I'm Muslim, my wife is Catholic. So for us, this whole myth about not being able to integrate, I think, is just plainly wrong. Towards the second half of last year, out of sheer frustration for the lack of progress on the political side, I started to think we need to do something else. Because I could almost foresee, whilst the Geneva process was trying to get along, and there has been some notable progress in only getting a process going, it's not enough. And what we also realized that actually it was a picture, it was a YouTube clip, or it was an artist speaking that actually had a much greater resonance. I as a talking head, can go on many televisions, I can write many articles, but I don't seem to have the impact in terms of getting really to publics. And I think that is the single greatest challenge that we face today, and I would encourage you all to perhaps think of it in this way too. We have to plug the empathy gap that exists between publics worldwide, all of us here, and the situation inside Syria and its consequences much more. This is the worst humanitarian disaster for decades, arguably since the Second World War, and yet it doesn't seem to have the resonance. We have to keep asking ourselves, why is that? And of course, it's complicated, and there are different narratives, and it's confusing. But at its core, it is about human beings. It is about providing support. And if we were to do it is about enforcing international law. If we were to do simply that, I'm sure that Syrians would be able to find a way to live with each other and to rebuild their lives. So with that in mind, we started to focus on what we call the We Care project, a way to bring people worldwide emotionally involved, much more emotionally involved in the Syrian case, and to use music, to use artists, to use the power of celebrity. Now, there have been many events and many great campaigns which are going on, many of which you are involved. But the simple truth is that it's not added up to enough of a critical mass at this point in time to plug, to bridge, to close that empathy gap. And so that's why we thought of an event to start this particular movement, the We Care project. It is a concert. We are planning a concert in late October in Istanbul, London, and New York. We are right now trying to reach out to the world's biggest artists. I can't mention them all to you, but we are at its heart trying to bring Adele, Beyonce, Shakira, and others together to collaborate, to bring Syrian artists, to bring Arab artists, and to make this a truly global event. At its heart, and for it to work, we need to use not the 20th century tools of Live Aid, which was 9 satellites, which helped integrated tech and broadcasting platform. And that is why I was in the West Coast. That's why I've been speaking to the BBC and others around us. We've gained numbers of partners in what we are doing, including Save the Children, including Syrian NGOs working on the ground. And the aim is basically to raise awareness, to get people more directly involved, for us to be able to reach the top shop and say we can do something here, and to raise money as well, to help Syrians rebuild their own lives, because we know that they can. If they get the kind of support that you are trying to provide in education, in employment, in starting up their businesses, as well as those areas in health where there is a crying need. I can tell you more about that if you would like, and I'd like to stop there, and I don't know if I have time to take any questions, but I'd be happy to do so.
2 questions.